Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to start in a minute. Good morning, everyone. My name is Bijan Ahmadi, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy. It is my absolute pleasure today to welcome you all to the first annual Middle East Strategy Forum. During the next 2 days, we'll host panel discussions, keynote speeches, and one-on-one conversations with over 40 experts from 10 different countries. Nearly 1,000 foreign policy professionals from across the world have registered for this conference, and we'll follow the speeches and the panels through different platforms where we are live streaming the conference. The Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, or IPD, is a Canadian nonprofit and nonpartisan foreign policy think tank dedicated to promoting sustainable peace through diplomacy, dialogue, and constructive engagement. Prioritizing dialogue and constructive engagement might seem unachievable or difficult, especially when we talk about the Middle East, a region that has been devastated by conflict, war, and terrorism for too long. But as an institute dedicated to the cause of peace, through these events, such as the conference we're hosting today and tomorrow, our aim is to bring together decision makers and experts with diverse views to discuss and debate complicated foreign policy issues of our time. Through these discussions, we can develop a more comprehensive understanding of each side's perspectives and help policymakers in adopting creative and open-minded policies premised on tolerance for cultural pluralism and different ways of life, enthusiasm for diplomatic engagement and non-coercive instruments of power, and a commitment to military restraint. Middle East Strategy Forum 2021 is the first Canadian conference that brings together top thinkers from around the world to discuss current and emerging issues in the region with respect to foreign policy, defense, trade, and humanitarianism. We'll discuss great power competition in the region, non-proliferation, regional rivalries, humanitarian aid policy, and opportunities for trade and investment in West Asia. Grasping an in-depth understanding of these critical themes will be imperative for Canada and its international partners in crafting a nuanced and even-handed Middle East strategy that can advance our national interests. I would like to acknowledge and thank the Hill Times, Al Monitor, the American Conservative as the media sponsors of MESF 2021, and the Quincy Institute and Toronto Finance International as supporting organizations for this conference. Some quick housekeeping notes. All the 12 sessions in this conference are live streamed through both Zoom and YouTube. Those of you who have registered already have received all the information through email. You can also simply go to the IPD website, peacediplomacy.org, and there is a post there which is titled Live Stream Middle East Strategy Forum 2021. As you scroll down through this page, you can see the conference schedule and the Zoom and YouTube links associated with each of the panels. Note that there are separate links for each of the panel discussions hosted as part of this conference. The conference schedule on our website is based on Eastern Standard Time. We kindly ask you to share the live stream link with your network. Also, during the conference, as you're listening to the speeches and panel discussions, don't forget to share highlights or share your perspective, your opinion with us using a hashtag MESF 2021 on social media. Without further ado, to start the first session, I would like to invite my good friend and colleague, Younes Zangiabadi, the Executive Vice President of IPD, who will lead the conversation with Mr. Lawrence Wilkerson. Younes, please go ahead.
Thank you, Bijan, for the opening remarks and your introduction. I also like to welcome and thank everyone for joining us today for this unique and comprehensive forum on the Middle East strategy. For our first session of the day, I have the honor of introducing and leading a conversation with a renowned keynote speaker, retired United States Army Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who served as the Chief of Staff to the U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell from 2002 to 2005. Wilkerson served in the U.S. Army for 31 years and taught at the U.S. Naval College and George Washington University. He is now a distinguished adjunct professor of government at the College of William and Mary in Virginia. Wilkerson is also a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Without further ado, let me thank you once again, Larry, for accepting our invitation to give a keynote address for the first annual Middle East Strategy Forum. The floor is yours. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Younes, and thanks to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy for hosting this most opportune conference. In that regard, everyone will probably expect me to talk about the crisis du jour, which of course is going on right now in the Levant, at the top end of it, if you will, with Israel and the Palestinians. I'm not going to, except ancillarily. I'll be glad to answer questions about that as best I can, but I want to get up into the ether a bit and talk from a geostrategic, geopolitical point of view. Now, those are two terms that we toss around a lot. And what I mean by that simply is from a very much presidential perspective with regard to Washington and with regard to our allies and other capitals from Berlin to Tokyo with regard to international relations. And I want to fashion my remarks along 5 or 6 lines. The first of which is a question from a security perspective: should diplomatic power replace military power in the Levant? And I have to add, from my own time listening to Condi Rice, the National Security Advisor, speak when I was with Powell at State, North Africa, because we called it MENA for the first time, as I recall, at that moment for policy purposes, Middle East and North Africa. And when I talk about Africa, I'm really talking about the greater part of that continent, not so much the new strategic cockpit of strategic competition, the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb, now having replaced the Persian Gulf in terms of real security interests, so much as I am the rest of Africa. So when I speak of Africa, I'll speak of the militarization of Africa, which came with the creation of something we'd fought for 40 years in my military, a unified command for the military for Africa, turning the last vestige of the world over to the United States military. So first point, from a security perspective, should diplomatic power replace military power in the Levant? What would such a change, second point, mean for the United States military? Third, how would Russia and China react? Would they, so to speak, as many are saying, move into the void? Or would they continue, particularly China, whose strategy has been ever since I went to the Central Party School and discussed things with them in 2009, more Sun Tzu-like than Clausewitz-like, soft power. Russia might be a little bit different animal in that regard, but Russia is a gas station with a capital, Moscow, and a decreasing population. And so the fear we have of Russia, in my mind, is greatly exaggerated. Nuclear weapons aside, of course. Next point, how would Turkey react? Next, how would the Gulf states react? And then lastly, and on everyone's mind probably today, how would Israel react? What would the situation with Israel be were the United States to replace military power with diplomatic power? And by diplomatic power, of course, I mean economic power, political power, financial power, humanitarian assistance, disaster relief power, all the elements that we sometimes refer to as soft power. How did we get to where we are as I talk about the military being replaced by diplomacy? Because I mean that, emphatically I mean that. I mean getting the military essentially out of land-based operations in the Levant. We got there because of Osama bin Laden. We got there because of Saddam Hussein. We got there because of some really tragic mistakes by the United States in the past 2 decades. We put major military forces on the ground in a region where, as I said, for 40 years in my time in the military, 31 of those, we said that was verboten. You did not put military forces on the ground because they would be an invitation to conflict and an invitation to strikes on them, indeed. We had what is now sort of glancingly called offshore balancing theory or offshore balancing strategy, or however you want to refer to it. Realists have picked it up. What it meant was we had carrier battle groups, we call them then carrier strike groups now, marine amphibious ready groups and so forth, always in the vicinity. Not in the Persian Gulf, maybe not even in the Sea of Oman, but somewhere in the Indian Ocean where if a fracas were to occur that we needed to use military power to quieten down, we could do it, and we could do it without forces on the ground permanently in the region. We did it in Operation Earnest Will, when we reflagged Kuwaiti tankers when the Iranians were mining the Gulf. We did it in Operation Praying Mantis, when we actually used kinetic force to sink an Iranian destroyer and almost destroy another one until President Reagan called us off. We, who was we? We was U.S. Pacific Command. There was something called the JSCAP, the Joint Strategic Capabilities Plan at that time. And what that did was allocate the majority of U.S. forces in the Indian and Pacific Oceans to U.S. CINCPAC. That is to say, the commander in Honolulu at Camp Smith. And we would allocate very niggardly, very stingily, we would allocate forces to this tiny little thing called the Rapid Deployment Joint Task Force, and then later Central Command, as we made it a unified command. They were always lusting for a headquarters of note in the region. They were always lusting to put troops on the ground in the region, and there's a major point. Whenever you let your military, believe me, I was there, I did this, find it has a new scent, a new elephant to swallow, it will swallow that elephant and look for more elephants. And that's essentially what has happened. So what do we have today? We have the greatest laydown of military force in the world in the Levant. We have the greatest reception facility for troops and equipment logistics in Kuwait. We have the largest fleet headquarters for the 5th Fleet in Bahrain. We have the largest air force on the face of the earth base in Qatar at Al Udeid. We have 2 or 3 like that in Saudi Arabia as well. We exercise with everyone from Egypt to Kuwait. This is a monumental laydown of forces and, importantly, military contractors who make a fortune off that region. So I'm not trying to diminish the challenge for one to decide to do this sort of thing. It would be huge because we've let it happen. We have let my military, America's military, consume our policy in the Levant. And they are trying to do the same thing in Africa. What would Russia and China do if we made an appreciable retreat from the area? And I hesitate to use the word retreat because I would call it a repositioning of forces to more important things and less war-provoking things. What would China do? I submit China would do almost nothing other than continue what it is doing. It's having a field day with the United States right now anyway. Already surpassed us in purchasing power parity in economic terms, the most important measurement of any economy, and soon to pass us in gross domestic product, which I think is a particularly fallacious metric anyway. But China would continue its soft power approach to that region. Do they have forces in Djibouti? They do indeed, along with the Japanese, the French, the Italians. Soon, I'm told, Erdogan, searching for a revivified Ottoman Empire, may have one on the coast of the Red Sea, maybe with Sudan, who knows. But there are lots of people in Djibouti. One Marine said to me, if we put another Marine on Djibouti tomorrow, it will sink. And of course, the leader of Djibouti plays each force against the other and all against themselves and makes more hay while the sun shines. But that is a strategic deployment that I would hasten to criticize. I would say, however, that again, the best force for protecting U.S. strategic interests in the Bab el-Mandeb and the Red Sea is a naval force, not a force on the ground unless it absolutely becomes a necessity. And I can envision a scenario where it would, that the naval forces couldn't handle anything that might arise, as they have been doing for the past 20 years. So looking at it from that perspective, I don't think China would put Russia and China together. Russia and China together, oh, let's just put the rest of the world with them. Let's put 190 plus nations with them. Have roughly 70 to 80 military bases overseas, if we want to use a definition of base that says something more than a bed and a cup of coffee. America has 800. America has 800 bases. There's no way Russia or China could compete, and in 20 years they wouldn't be able to compete. Yes, China's looking for Sri Lanka, looking for other places where it can put its submarines for tending and put its ships for retrofitting and refitting and so forth. Yes, that's an important thing to keep an eye on, but it's not something that even comes close to resembling even what America has across the span of the globe. Russia's another matter. What would Russia do? Well, Russia, as I said, is a gas station with a capital. It's losing population. Pakistan has more people in it than Russia. Its longevity is going down. Putin is in political trouble for the first time in his time in office, really significant political trouble. And yes, there are lots of nuclear weapons, and let me asterisk that as a real threat to the world, not just to the United States, as are our nuclear weapons. And we need to be dealing with that, and you deal with that with good, reinvigorated, and probably spread into multilateral veins arms control, nuclear arms control. So I don't think Russia would flow into any vacuum that the US created so adamantly as some people are saying, because they simply don't have the assets to do that. And they don't have the intent and the desire to do that. Maybe something in Libya, if Libya ever stabilizes to the point where they could do that and invites them in. They tried it in Cuba. Remember what happened there. Let's go on to, let me move to one of the other points. Before I get to Turkey, let me talk about the Gulf states. We're seeing that right now. We're seeing that right now because Trump, regardless of his bamboozlement of Riyadh and his sword dance and his pretensions to being a tough warrior and everything, really did very little. Nothing was done when they shot down our very expensive drone, they being the Iranians. Nothing was done when the attack occurred on the Saudi facilities and other incidents. Yes, we assassinated Qasim Soleimani, and several others. But we really didn't give Mohammed bin Salman and others in the region great confidence. And in comes President Biden, and the expectation is that what I'm talking about, at least partially, the beginning of it, might actually happen. And so look what they're doing. They're talking. They're talking with Tehran, and others are talking with Tehran. And Oman is doing its usual role of providing good offices and so forth. That's what we want to happen. And I submit that is what would happen across the board, were the United States not to be so present and holding the hands of the dictators and others who would challenge the status quo on a routine basis, as long as they, like Secretary Gates said, felt they could essentially have their policy to the last dead American. That's not the way things should be going on in the Gulf. So the Gulf states, I think, would do more of what they're doing right now. Would they form a security organization that would look like a little NATO? They've tried that many times. The GCC is pretty much moribund in my mind. I don't know. And I don't know how effective it would be if they did, particularly if it omitted the real hegemon in the Persian Gulf, Iran. Now, if they included Iran in it, it might be a bit contentious and their councils might be rough, but it might work over time. Turkey. Turkey is an unknown right now. The question on Turkey, with Erdogan at the helm and perhaps any successor, is, do they go neutral? Do they stay in NATO and try once again to court the EU? Or do they become an independent, not necessarily neutral, because they would be an independent leader of the Islamic world? And if they try for that, are they an independent leader of a radical Islamic world, or a more Turkish-like, before Erdogan at least, Islamic world? That's a huge question. So I can't answer what Turkey would do, but I can say, despite having probably the most formidable land army in NATO, other than the United States. I don't think they would be a factor that couldn't be dealt with if the United States were to do as I'm saying. Last but not least, the issue that is on our minds today because of the brutal conflict in that region right now, Israel. I think there is a distinct possibility that in the next decade, if it hasn't already in piecemeal fashion occurred, Israel will cease being a democracy. I also think, and this is highly provocative amongst my national security colleagues, Israel will cease being a state, a viable state, in the next 20 to 25 years on its current course. So what would this do for Israel? One, it would make Israel grow up and seek some sort of accommodation other than killing everyone in sight and or letting the United States do that for them. Remember that philosophy of the neoconservatives when I was in government? Let's just put the region in constant turmoil and Israel will be safe because neither the Persians nor the Arabs can gang up, and certainly not together, to do any damage to Israel. Well, look what's happening right now. One of the biggest supporters of the Sunni, largely Hamas, is Iran. And that's where a lot of those missiles are probably coming from. How's that working out, Israel? On another point of view, if you look at the entire situation with regard to the Palestinians, where there are 6 million plus inside the former 1967 borders Israel, and in the West Bank and the Golan Heights and Gaza, you look at a population that outnumbers the Israelis. Imagine if that plus the other millions in Jordan were to do in a more significantly violent way what they're doing now in unity, striking, and so forth and so on. You might have a real problem on your hand. So the only way you make Israel grow up, get a new government, a government that's interested in peace and stability, is you leave and you do some other things while you're doing it. You do some things like cut that amount you're giving them every year, now up to $3.84 billion. I remember when I was at state, we didn't have any money left after we gave Egypt their requisite money for not attacking Israel and maintaining the peace treaty. And after we gave Israel its requisite money, we had hardly anything left for diplomacy, for foreign policy. So I think it would be a healthy situation for Israel, making them have to deal with things without the lawyer at their back all the time. Instead, an honest broker at their back all the time, as I saw throughout most of my career in the military. We were an honest broker. The last time that was brought to real head was a heady, not to mince words here, but it was a heady time when George H.W. Bush managed to take out of the first Gulf War some leverage that he used, and that worked out pretty well until it got to the final talks. And it's anybody's guess, but I think the Israelis and Clinton's administration had as much to do with derailing that as Arafat and the Arabs did. So there are interests playing on both sides, of course, but it hasn't worked. So let's try something else. And the first thing we should try is taking military power out of the equation, except offshore. Now, as Frederick the Great said, supposedly others too, diplomacy without the military is like an orchestra without instruments or something to that effect. You get the message. So you don't take the military out of the picture entirely. It's always looking over the diplomat's shoulder, but it's not pushing him away and taking over his portfolio or her portfolio. That's not the way it should operate. We need a better mix of all the elements of national power. Military at the bottom, if you will, with regard to the Levant. So that's my recommendation. That's my talk. That's my lead off for your conference. And I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Larry, for your opening remarks. You covered a wide range of topics in your keynote speech, and I'll try to ask you some questions to dig a bit deeper into this complex issues. And so what struck me the most in your speech was the extent of the US military on the ground in the region, which I see to some level as a byproduct of this neoconservative and interventionist foreign policy mindset that is still quite alive in the American defense and foreign policy establishment. So given that you used to be part of that establishment and you were part of the conversation that led to the US invasion of Iraq, do you find any kind of differences in the actors or the methodologies used to still advocate for such a Middle East policy in Washington?
That's an excellent question. And a direct answer and simple answer is a little more sophistication and a little more camouflage and a little less overt advocacy of the policies that are obviously piecemealed to an extent, but compose their portfolio. I think that's more dangerous. I really do. You've sort of got the John Boltons and those like him, the Richard Pearls, on the outside now looking in a way that, as Powell used to say, is a lot better than having him on the inside. And you've got them to a certain extent discredited, but I don't for a minute think that they aren't still working. And here's the real problem. This is what I teach, and I've studied it from 1947 to the present day, and my students have taught me far more than I ever taught them in their case study presentations and so forth. We have created a complex, and I won't just call it the military-industrial congressional complex, though that's an apt term, but a complex that permeates everything, think tanks, certainly political office. As Eisenhower said, or was wont to say at times, it even goes into the home and hearth. We have so much money pouring into the coffers of politicians from things like entities like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Grumman, and a host of universities accepting massive money from DOD and others, DOE and the nuclear weapons program, for example. We have an incredible complex that is very difficult to describe today that they can use because it is predisposed to warfare. Constant warfare is wonderful. I remember an executive from Raytheon who was trying to hire me right before I left the State Department. First thing I said to him was, get out of my office. You can't do this. It's illegal. I'm still serving. But as he was exiting, he was mentioning some things about how Tomahawk missiles, for example, something I know quite a bit about as we introduced them in the Pacific, were slowing down at production rates. And those production rates needed to come up. Well, how do you get them to come up? You get somebody to shoot 52 into Syria, or you get someone to shoot them somewhere else. That's a reality that we aren't dealing with in America. This is huge influence on politicians, not just Jim Inhofe, not just the usual characters, Bob Menendez and others who really never met a defense budget they didn't love. It's permeating almost all of the Congress in one way or another. You get someone like Bernie Sanders when it's the F-35, partially made in Vermont, who's for the F-35, or Elizabeth Warren. It is polluting. It is corruptive. And then the second part of it is we don't know anything better. We throw military force at every problem in the world. And we have let the military assume that role, and it has become very eager to assume that role, despite its sometimes protests to the contrary. It doesn't want to give up a penny. You could cut $100 million a year for 10 years, total of $1 trillion, out of the national security budget, and you would have a more effective military at the end of the day. But the generals and admirals in the Pentagon don't want to do that because it requires them to think. It requires them to actually begin to ponder, are these legacy systems like $14 billion Ford-class aircraft carriers really necessary when the Chinese will put one on the bottom of the sea with 5,000 people in Davy Jones' locker in about 5 minutes? That's what's going to happen. If it's in the South China Sea or wherever it might be. Now, we might ultimately win. I suspect we would, but that's going to be traumatic for the American people. We don't need to have that happen. Anyway, the complex is alive and well.
Yeah, thank you very much. And you just mentioned China. Now let me shift gears toward another area of concern that you very well touched upon in your speech, and that is the increasing role of Russia and China in the region, especially as we are moving toward a multipolar international order. In this regard, I have a twofold question for you. First, how similar or different do you assess Beijing and Moscow in challenging the US long-standing role and influence in the region? And second, do you think that they have overlapping interests, or do you think their increased involvement could potentially put them at odds with each other in the long term?
Another good question. One that some colleagues and I were batting around the other day. One who knows China much better than I, and another who is in Russia at this particular moment. I think this is an alliance of convenience, if it indeed is some sort of an alliance. Don't see it being having much longevity. Here's what's put it together. What's put it together is some of the most horrible, brutal, colossal strategic errors by the number one power in the world, the United States of America, over the past 20 years. And we could just put a board up and tick them off. Everything from our reaction after 9/11. I remember vividly having a conversation. Why are we using the war instrument? We've used the law enforcement instrument all the time in the past. The war instrument will make them warriors. It will make the Taliban and Al-Qaeda warriors. It will elevate them, not diminish them. But we understood at State that the political realities were that the president had to hold that public press conference and say, this was not an act of terrorism, this was an act of war. But what stupid words, really, if you think about it deeply, critically. We use the military instrument in a way that now reflects on the military, I think, awfully poorly. 20 years and nothing really to show for it, except many Afghans whom we have to get through the visa waiver process and make citizens in the United States as the country collapses as we leave. Iraq, tragic era that put essentially the balance of power that had been maintained since the end of the Iran-Iraq war and before out of the question. It was gone. So we either had to stay and be the pivot, or we would leave and appoint someone else. Well, there was no one else to appoint. So we hung around there for a while too and made a mess of that country. Russia under Putin has picked up on every strategic era, to include my president going to Tbilisi and saying they were going to be a member of NATO. You saw what that produced immediately afterwards, and so did the young but charismatic president of Georgia at the time. This is just idiotic, what we have done over the last 20 years, not even talking about the endless stupid wars and Libya and the other Syria and the other places. Putin has capitalized on that. We have made him strong. We have kept him in office to a certain extent because was politically popular to the tune of 70, 80% in Russian polls because of the way he was treating us after the way we had treated them, raping, pillaging, and plundering Bob Rubin, Anatoly Chubai, Larry Summers, and a host of others who took Harvard's endowment shot up, almost doubled overnight. Why did Larry Summers become president of Harvard? There we go, QED. This is mostly our fault, and so we have to stop that. We just have to stop that. Just had a student present his honors thesis. Summing it up, NATO expansion has ended, and he said, "Why?" Much more than I just did. He's right. He's right. It was a mistake to do what we did in the face of Moscow and intersperse our interest with their interest in a way that had to be responded to. Now, let's just look at what Mike Sweeney wrote in a piece recently. Were we to go to war with China in the South China Sea, over Taiwan, over the islands, over Philippine fishing rights, whatever it might be, were we to go to war with Russia over Ukraine, there is a very good chance we'd lose the first engagements, catastrophically so. What would we do then, says Mike? Well, what we should do is back up, reevaluate, and say, hey, we're better than they are. We're a more robust economy. We have a much more sound republic. It's democratic. Let's wait this out. Let's go to the second phase and the third phase. No, Mike says, the danger is we would probably go nuclear. And why is that the case? Because both powers are operating on interior lines. That's a very sophisticated concept for most people, but it means we're miles away from the conflict and they're right there. 80,000 Russian troops on the Ukraine border. We have an all-volunteer force that couldn't fight for 15 minutes against a real enemy in a real war. We'd have to go to conscription. We'd have to build up the country. We'd have to take them back. And who says it's going to happen that way anyway? Why don't they just take down our gas stations? Last weekend, the lines at gas stations here in Northern Virginia disappeared in sight. There were people everywhere trying to fill up with gas. Why not just do that? Why not take down our financial system? Why not take down our energy grid? All easy to do. Believe me, I've done the work on it. I've looked at it after 9/11 and before 9/11, even when we were thinking about something called network warfare. That's how wars are going to be fought in the future between powerful countries. So who says all these accoutrements of warfare are even going to get a chance to go into battle before the nation is brought to its knees in other ways? Or we bring someone else to their knees because we have capabilities too. So that's a long-winded answer, but I don't think the neoconservatives have gone away.
I really wish we could have continued our discussion, Larry, but we have an intense program for the day, and there is a panel discussion coming up next titled A New Middle East Security Architecture in the Making, which begins actually in 9 minutes Eastern time, and it goes until 11:45. And we have a diverse and distinguished panel of experts joining, and I highly recommend our viewers to join that panel if they can. With that, I would like to end the first session, and thank you again, Larry, for sharing your thoughts and your invaluable perspectives with us today.
Thank you for having me, and I will be sure to stay tuned in.
Perfect. Sounds good. Thank you very much.